19th century Worthing was famous for its demonstrations, tumults and riots. A lot of these disturbances centred around what was known as rough music. This was when groups of people, usually young men and lads with blackened faces, would assemble at a certain point to show their disapproval of the behaviour of someone living in the town. One of the most notorious examples took place here at Greville Terrace, the buildings just behind the rowing club, in 1850. The occupant was a Mrs. Louisa Francis, who lived there with her husband. They'd recently moved to the town and don't seem to have gelled very well with the local community. It would appear that scandal and gossip were rife, and one spring day while out walking along Worthing seafront, Mrs. Louisa Francis came into conflict with Mrs. Susan Tinling of Warwick House, the big house that stood north of the Steine in those days. They exchanged harsh words that culminated with Mrs. Tinling shouting at Mrs. Francis, "If it wasn't Sunday, I'd do for you, you infamous old Jezebel. I'd give it to you all round." Now, what the exact cause of this outburst was, we don't know. What we do know, though, is that the Francis brought an action for libel against Mrs. Tinling. Mrs. Tinling was extremely distressed in court, and her distress was picked up by members of the local community, who decided that the Francis would have to receive rough music as a punishment. One evening, as the sun was setting, a group of several dozen young men and lads assembled opposite Greville Terrace with blackened faces and with pots and cans into which they'd placed beach pebbles that they began to shake ever louder, ever more fiercely, accompanying the shaking with moans and groans and shouts, all directed against the Tinlings. Having carried this on for about an hour, they then got hold of large flint pebbles from the beach, which they hurled with force against the house, eventually smashing every pane of glass. Throughout this whole demonstration that culminated in this violent finale, the Worthing police were nowhere to be seen. As a rule, the Worthing police made themselves pretty absent when rough music was taking place. The upshot was that the Francis were forced out of Worthing, and they weren't the only respectable family to receive this form of extreme intimidation. Bedford House, that stood at the end of Bedford Row where the Southdown bus garages now are, saw a similar demonstration 9 years later in 1859.